Good afternoon. I'm Daniel Bélan. I'm the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, and I would like to welcome you to this talk on the case for supply management and fairer food systems with Dr. Jodey Nurse, who's sitting just here. I would like first to acknowledge that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We do this to acknowledge the importance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, known as MISC, is the Center for Canadian, Quebec, and Indigenous Studies programs at McGill University. MISC supports a multidisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues about the country's past, present, and future. In addition to our academic programs, MISC also hosts public events such as the talk that you will just listen to on a wide range of topics that are important to Canadians. And I would say today this topic is very important. We discuss a lot food prices right now due to the inflation crisis, but supply management, of course, is something we have been debating in this country for literally decades. And so we are really glad today to have Jodey Nurse, faculty lecturer in our Canadian Studies program. Dr. Nurse was a research assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Waterloo. She's also a past L.R. Wilson assistant professor at the Wilson Institute for Canadian History at McMaster University and a former University of Waterloo postdoctoral fellow. In 2016, she completed her PhD at the University of Guelph. And so I'm really glad that we have Dr. Nurse with us today. She will deliver her lecture, and after that we'll have a Q&A. Dr. Nurse, it's all yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for that land acknowledgement and introduction, Danielle, and thank you truly to everyone. I see some of my students in the crowd. I appreciate your support, some of my colleagues. And, I want to start talking today about, supply management and fair food systems by reminding us, of course, that for all of us, food is a daily preoccupation. What to eat, how much, where to purchase our foodstuff. These are just some of the questions that come to mind. And of course, for those folks who are food insecure, the most pertinent questions may be, will I eat today, and at what cost? And with today's crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which have contributed sharply to increases in food prices and rising food insecurity around the world, food issues have become especially concerning. Of course, worries about food and food systems are not new. Over the last number of decades, a combination of factors, including global population growth, political unrest, environmental degradation, climate change, market speculation, unfair trade practices, to name just a few, have intensified. And food activists and scholars have been particularly vocal about the fact that the turn to greater trade liberalization and other neoliberal policies in agriculture since the 1980s have helped facilitate greater volatility in food markets, not less, in the world today. As Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and Sustainability, Jennifer Clapp notes, today's food crisis is one of a series of major crises in the last 50 years that have signaled to many what those studying issues of food security have known for some time. That is, as more people source their food from the global food industrial system, they become increasingly vulnerable to shocks that have worldwide impact. The question will also, also can be can this current system that we have, can it meet the growing needs of a global population that just, recently, as we probably all read in the news, topped 8 billion people? Many do not believe so. CLAP and others encourage policymakers to seek fundamental transformations that can secure fairer, more sustainable, and resilient food systems for the future, rather than simply attempting to intensify industrial modes of food production for global market trade, which, as they contend, contributed to these issues in the first place. Of course, even among those who recognize change is necessary, what that change looks like is a source of debate. For instance, much of the literature that discusses paths towards food security use some version of the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, definition of food security, which defines the term as, quote, a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, social, economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life, end quote. While certainly a desired goal, critics of this definition tend to point out the fact that it ignores the defining power relations that determine production, distribution, and consumption patterns within our food systems. Furthermore, governments, including Canada's, have promoted increased agricultural trade liberalization and the concentration of food production in the hands of fewer and larger agribusiness corporations as a means of achieving food security, when in fact, this has only increased instability in the international arena and devastated domestic agricultural systems as farmers find themselves unable to compete with influxes of low-priced, often subsidized commodities that saturate their local markets. Indeed, as some criticize, quote, far from ensuring food security, these policies create widespread food insecurities and vulnerabilities. So, instead, a growing number of scholars and activists are calling for a movement for food sovereignty in Canada. Food sovereignty being broadly defined as, quote, the right of nations and peoples to control their own food systems, including their own markets, production modes, food cultures, and environments. This is therefore an argument for community-based, producer-led systems where possible, fair trade when needed, and sustainable food production as a means for genuine food security. It is this focus on regionally based food systems that is one of the central pillars of the food sovereignty movement. The need for agricultural policies oriented not just towards exports, but towards agricultural production for domestic consumption, and measures that ensure farmers receive adequate incomes to allow for sustainability, be that environmental, economic, and social. And so in thinking about these issues, about the failure of global markets to ensure more secure and sustainable food systems, and the growing power asymmetries at the heart of most supply chains, one must wonder about what alternative marketing models exist and what lessons they can provide as we consider the broader transformations in our food systems that many are arguing need to occur. One such marketing model, of course, is Canada's system of supply management. Indeed, this is a uniquely Canadian system instituted in the milk, egg, and poultry sectors in the 1960s and 1970s to deal with issues of overproduction, depressed farm prices, market volatility, and the inability of the Canadian government to compete with the subsidization regime that characterized agricultural supports in the United States and elsewhere at the time. Based on three central pillars: fair producer pricing, production discipline through quotas, and import management, the system was created to match domestic production to demand. Although each industry has its particularities and the system of supply management has evolved since its creation, these central pillars remain the same. So by that very definition, it is not surprising that those in support of neoliberal strategies premised on the concepts of free trade, the rule of the market, deregulation, privatization, and eliminating governments in creating policies for public good in favor of the theory of trickle-down economics, that they're opposed to such a system. But as I noted earlier, more and more people are recognizing how many of the vulnerabilities we see in today's global food system are a result of earlier policy failures, including policies that have privileged export-oriented agricultural production and global food systems at the expense of domestic systems. It would appear now that we must question whether returning to these old responses for addressing food crises, let alone extending them, makes sense when they played a prominent role in exacerbating the impact of the current crisis. Indeed, it is because of the capitalist market economy's consequences for our environment, for rural sustainability, and for the conditions of many farmers and farm workers around the globe that alternative agriculture and food models are being pursued. As I will argue, supply management was and is valued because of its focus on domestic production. Its ability to ensure farmers receive fair prices and incomes without government subsidies, capacity to keep more and smaller family farms operating than would be otherwise, which contributes significantly to rural sustainability, its role in mediating issues of market power, and finally, in the stability and security of supply it allows. My talk will also provide a closer historical examination of the creation of supply management. This context is important if we are to appreciate the functions it has served and continues to serve today. I agree with other historians working on topics of public policy that history provides a valuable way of identifying and thinking about, quote, the interests of various governments, the processes and institutions through which policy is developed and implemented, the views and values of the state and non-state actors, and how those attitudes can provide historically informed interpretations of contemporary issues. I also agree wholeheartedly that, quote, without an appreciation of the many changing realities that influence individual and collective decision-making, policymakers will continue to focus on short-term solutions. If we look to the past, we can see how supply management was instituted at a time when ideas about the common good and cooperation versus sometimes destructive competition had social and political resonance. And although there were certainly those who were critical of a scheme they argued infringed on individual rights, ultimately, producers and consumers generally came to recognize the value of a system that worked for this common good. Despite the rise of the neoliberal paradigm that followed and held that agriculture is an economic sector no different from any other, the idea that the state has an important role in ensuring fair play and serving the public good, especially in the case of food, has continued. So certainly, if we look back at the history of farming, we can readily see its precarious nature. This is not a new concept, but since the mid-19th century, greater market integration globally and the beginnings of an industrial agricultural system saw farmers seeking out various measures to help protect them against unpredictable markets and powerful private interests in crop and livestock industries, and this really materialized in earnest in the 1910s and 1920s. For example, in the dairy sector, increased industrialization saw growing concentration in dairy processing and retail, while in the egg sector, cheaper international egg imports served to depress local prices. In both industries, cyclical overproduction also became an issue as several modernizing forces, including new technologies, improved animal genetics, and the expansion of herd and flock sizes increased productivity significantly. Generally, in the early part of the 20th century, government departments of agriculture sought to help farmers by enacting policies that focused on quality control regulations and standardization or disease control, education, rather than interfering in the marketplace. Farmers were told that with more effective promotion, better farm management, including greater economy, and more, quote, ambition to produce and business ability to handle the product, end quote, they could be successful. Overall, the message was to be more efficient, produce more, and develop export markets. These were the answers they offered farmers for their problems. And my question is to you, does this sound familiar? Because it should. This is exactly what many economists today argue farmers should do to improve their circumstances. And what critics of supply management suggest that the supply managed sectors need to do. They would be stronger if deregulated, and farmers could focus on developing these export markets. What the past demonstrates, both in Canada and elsewhere in the world, however, is that calls for farmers to simply work harder and be more efficient have not worked, especially in farm products largely directed for local markets such as milk and eggs. Here, local solutions are required. These calls for increased production and the pursuit of international trade in the early 20th century certainly didn't improve most farmers' circumstances, although it did lead to greater concentration and specialization and capitalization, whereby farmers began to get big in an attempt to match competing economies of scale elsewhere, especially to our neighbors to the south, or they were forced to get out. But this was a period in which the government, again, was hesitant to involve itself directly in the marketplace. But despite this, farmers they recognized the need to cooperate, to institute effective measures to stabilize their industry. And this was articulated. It was increasingly common to hear these sentiments. For example, you had folks like the president of the Ontario Agricultural College, J.B. Reynolds, lamenting in 1923, after a period of depressed farm prices, how, quote, the capitalist system demanded human sacrifice, and agriculture was the only unorganized and unprotected industry. And certainly some farmers did attempt to organize. Various cooperatives and commodity pools were established during this period, but the voluntary nature of these groups often meant success was limited. Some provinces tried to establish marketing acts with greater regulatory powers in response. However, this early legislation was soon deemed unconstitutional, typically for attempting to restrict interprovincial trade. Farmers continued to express frustration about the market's inability to provide for their needs, but consensus remained elusive, and these constitutional issues with enacting effective legislation remained a barrier to action. By the time of the Great Depression, however, many more farmers were suffering, and orderly marketing schemes were demanded by many. Governments around the world were instituting price support structures and other protective measures for their agricultural industries, and Canada was no different. In 1934, the Federal Natural Products Marketing Act was passed, largely patterned on the British Agricultural Marketing Acts of 1931 and 1933, which allowed for the creation of marketing boards. And although it was ultimately, again, found unconstitutional in 1937 for infringing on provincial jurisdiction, it had created a network of marketing boards across the country, many of which survived under revised legislation. Again, the effectiveness of these boards, however, was limited because of the inability of provinces to legislate effective production and import controls. Before the Second World War, then, you had two rather strong narratives competing among farmers, advocates, and policymakers. For some, the idea that farmers just had to be better managers, better business people, they would say better businessmen because they didn't recognize women's roles in agriculture, and that they needed to participate in this global marketplace. But for others, there was a growing recognition that unequal power interests and unpredictable outside forces beyond farmers' control were increasing, and these forces required a collective response for the common good. The Second World War was an important turning point in many ways because it revealed the strengthened role the government could play in managing resources by intervening in the marketplace, especially in terms of agriculture and food. Indeed, central pillars of Canada's wartime command economy were rationing and price control. And although historians have tended to emphasize the resistance governments faced to these measures, work done by historian Ian Mosby suggests that most Canadians embraced such policies and accepted them as necessary for a shared goal of, quote, equality of sacrifice and fairness. Mosby's conclusions about Canadians' growing faith in the state's ability to intervene in and manage the post-war economy and acceptance of fair and equitable pricing for food are convincing, especially if one considers that marketing board supporters had already helped mobilize many consumers around ideas of controlled marketing during the Depression and the proliferation of these boards after the war. Although the government was eager to lessen its involvement and moved to relax protective measures after the war, the instability that followed led to the passage of the Agricultural Stabilization Act in 1958, whereby the Canadian government did indeed take on greater responsibility for assisting, quote, the industry of agriculture to realize fair returns for its labor and investment and to maintain a fair relationship between prices received by farmers and the costs of goods and services that they buy, thus to provide farmers with a fair share of national income. So again, recognizing this need for a fair share. But this act did not solve the ongoing and critical issue of overproduction. Indeed, overproduction of agricultural commodities, not underproduction, was driving down whole farm sectors. Nor did it address the power asymmetries between farmers and processors. These reoccurring problems only intensified, and price fluctuations were not just concerning for the producer. Certainly, there were many consumers complaining about the significant price swings in basic foodstuffs such as milk and eggs. Farmer incomes continued to decline despite these farm supports, and thus marketing boards, though still limited in their powers at this time, were increasingly popular. And this is not insignificant. Critics of these boards charged that they interfered with the laws of supply and demand and forced producer participation. By definition, a marketing board is a system of compulsory cooperation. Unlike voluntary cooperatives, marketing boards are generally more effective because they require all producers of a certain product in a specified region to be compelled by law to adhere to the regulations of a marketing plan, which typically has the approval of the majority of producers of that product. While the regulations imposed by marketing boards could vary significantly, the objective was the same: to maintain or increase, stabilize, and equalize the income of producers. Support for marketing schemes came from mainstream farm groups and among the leadership of commodity sectors like dairy, egg, and poultry. There was also strong support from provincial ministers of agriculture, who still at that time held some sway. And the farm problem was real, and the increasing cost price squeeze farmers suffered saw their incomes continue to decline, while the incomes of Canadians employed in basically every other sector of the Canadian economy improved significantly during this period. Certainly, the massive exodus off farms during that time reflected the difficulty of farmers' lives and the precarity of their positions. And Canadian governments, they were unhappy too. They chafed under the increasing costs of financial supports for agricultural producers that were not solving the issues. The Dairy Support Program for 1959 and 1960, for example, had involved a total cost to the government of at least $31 million. And let me be clear, many governments around the world with valuable dairy industries retained more control over dairy business after the war than before. And they moved to enact new regulations governing dairy production and trade. For example, Britain, New Zealand, Australia, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Switzerland, and Austria all introduced new legislation in the post-war period that enabled some sort of dairy support measures, including import restrictions, export subsidies, equalization schemes, and price supports. Remember also that when GATT was being negotiated and implemented, GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, agriculture was deemed exceptional, and it remained a highly protected sector of trade. In the 1950s, a GATT waiver allowed the U.S. to protect agricultural producers and markets, setting a precedent for everyone else. Between 1961 and 1962, it was estimated that the U.S. government spent $6.5 billion on agricultural subsidies alone. But while the United States could afford these subsidies, Canada could not. By the 1960s, the Canadian government recognized that the dairy and other farm support programs posed serious financial problems. A renewed interest in controlled marketing as a solution was again put forth, although many were still hesitant to accept marketing boards as a solution because they realized that without import and production controls, their effectiveness was severely limited. And so this is when we start to see national plans finally come to fruition. So finally, agreements among producers in the dairy sector and among the federal and provincial governments would see the creation of the Canadian Dairy Commission in 1966, with the mandate of coordinating federal and provincial dairy policies. And by the 1970s, the dairy industry became the first farming industry to operate under a national supply management system. In the case of eggs, the push towards a nationally coordinated system was aided by the chicken and egg war. I don't know if there's anyone in this room that can remember the chicken and egg war. It was a big deal at the time in 1970 and 71 that resulted when the Quebec government established the Fédération des producteurs de consommation du Québec, a marketing board that restricted the price, grading, and sale of all eggs, including egg imports from other provinces, which was not allowed at the time and led to other provinces to take various legal proceedings and retaliatory measures that saw the confiscation of alien eggs and illegal chickens at provincial borders, all of which made national headlines and prompted critics to warn about the balkanization of Canada's economy. This event witnessed the very urgent need for national coordination and interprovincial cooperation, which ultimately, and again, I'm not suggesting there were not challenges here, debates and intense discussion, but ultimately resulted in the passage of the Farm Products Marketing Agencies Act in January 1972 and the creation of the first Canadian Egg Marketing Agency later that year. The result of the hardship farmers faced during this period was enough to bring greater consensus with respect to the desirability of national systems of controlled production that would ensure the stability of domestic supplies while allowing farmers fair prices. This system emerged at a time when the realities of declining rural populations, of increasing boom and bust cycles, Fears about trends towards vertical integration and the loss of the family farm helped motivate farmers and policymakers to find real solutions. This is not to suggest that the system did not face challenges. As I mentioned, certainly in the years that followed, the ethos of competition grew stronger, and the stagflation of the 1970s had brought, Keynesian economics to a breaking point. But the legacy of increased government involvement was not wiped away, and fundamentally, the system proved effective in managing the chaotic agricultural scene, including the farm crisis of the late 1970s and early 1980s that materialized. And it also addressed, those increased and chronic issues of overproduction that plagued these industries in other parts of the world. Noting how deregulated markets had failed in the past, farmers in these sectors understood that systems were needed that allowed for, quote, the rural community to share in the national prosperity and participate truly in these policy decisions. Citing economic justice, proponents of supply management believed it provided farmers fair compensation for their investments and labor, and they criticized those who supported wage increases for workers in other sectors, but bemoaned increases in the prices paid to farmers. For them, food policies needed to be just to both the producer and the consumer. In the decades that followed, those involved in these farm sectors and the governments that supported them continued to recognize the value of a system that allowed for a coordinated response to managing markets through domestic quotas, limited imports, and fair pricing to ensure stability and profitability in the industry. And certainly this system helped farmers weather intense crises, of course for their benefit, but also for the benefit, I will argue, for consumers. Now, vocal critics of the system, such as Sylvain Charlebois at Dalhousie University, you've probably seen a few articles he's written, charge really on the regular that supply management costs consumers more. But from his own account, dairy products, for example, are now 9.7% more expensive compared to last year, while food prices overall are up 10.3%. Of course, he does not note that all the significant increases of dairy prices around the rest of the globe, including those in the United Kingdom, where milk is up 47.9% compared to last year. And food price inflation hit 16.2% in October. He is also more sympathetic to Canadian grocers earning sky-high profits and argues that there is little evidence of greedflation in the sector, and surprisingly quiet about the fact that it is the cost of unregulated products, such as vegetable oil, which is up 40%, that have increased most substantially. Supply management has also been supported by groups such as the National Farmers Union as a solution for maintaining smaller scale family farms in the face of the increasing corporate control of agriculture, which has witnessed, they argue, quote, the livelihoods of farmers and farm workers having become increasingly precarious. Indeed, a number of studies have pointed out how the increasing need for cheap farm labor has, especially in the United States, led to the normalization of overworked, underpaid, and generally poorly treated undocumented immigrant laborers. The labor of these workers is often the unrecognized subsidy of many cheap food policies. What has become clear is that for national supply management to be effective, there has had to be, quote, mutual trust, cooperation, and accommodation on the part of all involved. The need to create and strengthen relationships between those in the food system is central to the successful functioning of supply management. And that is indeed the mantra of those in the sector today, the need for cooperation among all participants, which I promise you does not always come easy, but is necessary for transformative change to materialize. This is a sentiment, I think, that those advocating for food security, for food sovereignty, can appreciate. The story of supply management also reveals that we must question economic models built on the idea of the rationality of actors in the economy, and that competition rather than cooperation will provide the best outcomes for society. Since the creation of supply management, the system has been credited with providing a bedrock of financial stability in rural Canadian communities. If we are to consider changes in our food systems that will improve food security and sovereignty and lead to better outcomes for all participants in our food systems, we must recognize what systems have consistently failed and what systems have proven strong. No doubt there will be more challenges in the future, but I would suggest that the resiliency of supply-managed industries in Canada, the renewed interest among farmers outside of Canada for alternative forms of orderly marketing in the face of other failing systems, and Canadians' own recognition and support for a system that ensures safe, stable, and healthy domestic foodstuffs at a fair price are extremely telling. So thank you very much.